This is the Big O Show. This is the Big O Show.
Spoke about the new hair product I was using, and I was going to say Ira knows all about that, but I figured that would be too mean and not the way to start off a Wednesday. But Jason and the greater good are bringing up some comments, some questions, and kind of going back and forth. And it's a good discussion. It's about, the Duncan Robinson and his role as a starter versus coming off the bench, which we've seen him be able to have some success doing before, which is kind of tough to do sometimes as a shooter. You've either got it or you don't. There's a different mindset for a closing pitcher versus a starting pitcher, things like that. It's the same thing with bench player versus starter. And then also Tyler Hero. And would you insert him into the starting lineup potentially, maybe in place of a Duncan Robinson? And I'll give you my take on this, and then I'll kind of give you the floor. This is all, you could potentially see certain things change with matchups. I still like the idea of having Bam and Duncan together to start games. And then you kind of read the room. You read the temperature of how the game goes on. And is Duncan hot? And I mean, is he hot shooting the ball? I'm not talking about is Duncan good looking. But is he able to hit his shots? Is he having a good, is he like, and so is that combo working? Is Bam working well off of Duncan? If that's working, then Duncan gets more minutes as the game goes on. And then Tyler kind of stays in his role coming off the bench, which he's obviously very comfortable with. And then you kind of make the decision on who gets the closing minutes. I don't think you want to have Duncan and Tyler playing a lot of minutes together closing, because I think we saw, and I remember especially in the Indiana series in the bubble, that when those two were on the floor together, I mean, Malcolm Brogdon would just pick whichever one that he could get ISO'd on and attack. You don't want that in the playoffs. So it's probably going to have to be an either or down the stretch. And I'm talking about when it goes possession for possession. But I do think a lot of it is matchup based, but I also think that sometimes we focus too much on who's starting as opposed to who's closing. And we focus more on who's out there in minute one as opposed to who gets more minutes overall as the game goes on. So that's my take on it. Wanted to get yours.
Well, it's interesting. The wild card, and we started the show with, and people can go back to the podcast and listen to the first segment, is the Victor Oladipo wild card. But what if Victor Oladipo is really good when he comes back? Yeah. Then I could see a situation where if you start Caleb Martin, you have another defender in your starting lineup. So Jimmy doesn't have to start with the toughest cover from minute one in a 48-minute playoff game. So
that's interesting. That's interesting. You say that if Victor is really, really good, it's not necessarily that you would put Victor in the lineup in place of Duncan. It's that Caleb might start. So go ahead.
So then you can have a lineup where you're going with Bam and PJ and Caleb and Jimmy and Kyle. So you're injecting someone there in the starting lineup and moving Duncan out of the starting lineup. Because then your top three off the bench, Hero, obviously, is going to be your sixth man regardless of how this sets up. But then in addition to Dedmon, you can play Victor Oladipo in that role, have a defender on the second unit alongside Tyler Hero instead of, say, a Max Strus or someone. You don't drop off that much defensively, and that becomes your top eight. So in a way, Victor Oladipo can impact Duncan Robinson. And this is what I was talking about in segment 2. You can catch that on the podcast later also, is that Kendrick Nunn type of move. Hey, this was good for the regular season. People thought we were going to be Team A. Aha! But we're going to be Team B come the playoffs and go in this direction. So the Oladipo thing not only looms as, hey, is Victor going to start? He's going to change our starting lineup. Is Victor going to be a rotation player? Because if Vic is a rotation player and you're primarily going 8 deep, then you're not only talking about maybe Gabe Vincent and Max Strus being out of the rotation, but Caleb Martin being out of the rotation, which I don't see for his overall contributions. He can still make the three. He can still be in that early running offense that they love to play anyway. And that way, Jimmy Butler at the start of the game doesn't have to take the top cover, whether it's DeMar DeRozan, whether it's Durant. You can give Caleb Martin that. And you know what? No offense. But if someone's going to get in foul trouble early, I would rather it be Caleb Martin than Jimmy Butler anyway. So there are possibilities. Again, as I mentioned earlier, because if you're a top 6 seed, you get a week off before your first playoff game as the play-in round people, 7, 8, 9, and 10, have their little mini tournament for 2 spots. Eric Spoelstra will have plenty of time to think this through, plenty of time to sit with his analytics people But again, it comes down to, when do we see Victor Oladipo? What do we see in Victor Oladipo? And how many minutes after almost a calendar year off can Victor Oladipo honestly play? That's why I still prefer him off the bench, Clay, because I think then if you play a player 15, 18, 20 minutes off the bench, it's a lot easier to do that than sort of covering up your starters where he only plays the top 6-8 minutes of the start of the first half and second half, and then you wonder if you have a fatigue player. So the Oladipo thing is a factor, and we haven't even mentioned on the show yet the Markieff Morris thing.
It's fascinating when you look at the difference that Victor Oladipo could make with this team, and you talk about the top 8, right? And I think that's, you talk about your playoff rotation, and what's Pat Riley's favorite saying? Play 8, trust 7, whatever it is. Like,
right,
I mean,
6, and just until you get down to one player who's going to give the ball.
Yeah, and so but if you look at your 8, if Victor Oladipo is healthy, you can easily make a case that it's the 5 current starters: Tyler Hero, Victor Oladipo, and Caleb Martin. And in which case it would make sense. And starting Caleb Martin is something I hadn't even thought about, because we do see that a lot early on in games where it's like, oh, why isn't player X, your star, your best defender, guarding the other player's best offensive player? And you don't want to get those guys in foul trouble. Whereas if you start a Caleb Martin and you tell him, and we saw it with Trae Young, he said, go guard Trae Young. Don't let him.
Like a rabid dog.
It keeps your other guys from getting into foul trouble, which is interesting. And so if Vic comes back and you bring him off the bench, you can see, which I think we both agree, that's kind of the more likely scenario. You could see a scenario where he is incredibly impactful to the entire rotation of this team while still not overly messing with the chemistry, because he is coming off the bench. And one thing to add to that, I love the idea of playing Victor and Tyler Hero together, extended minutes. I just think the complement is so good. And I think Tyler's the type where, you're right, I mean, he's good with the ball in his hands, but he's also really good without the ball. He's somebody that on offense, he's so smart, and there are nuances to the game that I think he's grown in as he's been in the league. And I think part of that is just like staying around somebody like Andre Iguodala and like soaking up every second, every ounce of knowledge that he could. You see how his game grows, and I think you could see a world where if he and Vic spend a lot of time together, both on the floor in practice and then during games, that duo could be really nasty coming off the bench. And the bigger thing is, the other team would have no way to defend it. They don't have the guys coming off the bench, the talent level of guys coming off the bench throughout the league. It's just what it is. It's not going to be when you have 2 starter caliber players coming off the bench. So all that to say, you try not to like envision a world where Victor Oladipo is like this, I'm not going to use the word savior, but like this enormous impact, him being, because you don't want to get your hopes up, and you also don't want the team to be rocked a bit if he gets hurt again. And yet if he's coming off the bench, I don't think it's going to have that enormous of a negative impact if he does get hurt again, and you can't rely on him down the stretch. So it's almost like the best of all worlds.
And like, I guess the plan I have, I guess we'll call it Plan W. I might as well take some credit. If you start Caleb, you can't play Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero together for extended minutes, because then you sort of going to wind up with a Swiss cheese defense. I mean, even Dwayne Dedmon's more of a charge taker than a shot blocker, so there's not necessarily that deterrent either. So it really changes everything. That's the thing, Clay. If you change your starting lineup that's been successful enough to perhaps get you a number 1 playoff seed, and it doesn't work, oh man, I mean, you're in for it. What the hell was Spoelstra thinking? So to be the mad professor comes with risks also, that you're changing a good thing to make it work. But the thing is, if you add Markieff back and you add Victor back, you're a different team. You just are a different team. And a good coach and a good scouting staff and a good analytics team finds a way to move players in to make your team even better. So again, it's almost like we're coming full cycle on this show. We talked about how Brooklyn could be better with Simmons and Dragic, and maybe with Mayor Eric Adams in New York getting rid of the vaccine mandate. We talked about how the 76ers with James Harden could take another step forward. We spoke about Karis LeVert going to the Cavaliers and potentially making them better. So everyone's had their little things. Boston, people are raving about their additions and what they've done with Derek White being added in there, and even Daniel Tice coming back and giving them a true backup center. Well, the Heat have that also. It just didn't come under the glare of the trading deadline. It came by people who were in their back pocket the entire season, just waiting to break them out. So it's interesting. We're talking about how the games, top of the show, we spoke about the upcoming schedule, about Chicago and Milwaukee and Brooklyn and Philadelphia and make or break time. And yet the Heat are still in the Petri dish. The Heat are still in the lab. The Heat still have tinkering to do, like the Nets do, like the Sixers do, like the Celtics do, like the Cavaliers do, which makes this all the more fascinating. I mean, you look at the Panthers, and they have their line set and their goaltending, and they know who they are, and they'll win a championship or won't with what they have. The Heat's going to be interesting because you and I are going to be talking about little subtle elements. Usually you don't talk about a leading playoff contender in March and April. They got some work ahead of themselves. It's going to be fascinating. How do you work in a Victor Oladipo? How do you work back in a guy who hasn't played since November 8th in a Markieff Morris? So this thing is still very fluid, surprisingly fluid heading into March.
Do you have any update on Markieff Morris and also Victor Oladipo, and just like broad update?
Markieff, I probably have more, is that the Heat fully expect him to be back and that he will contribute and that they're still waiting for some clearances, but all indications are in some form they will have Markieff back. He's been working at Stanley Remy's gym down here in Miami. He's been putting in the court time, working on his conditioning. And the fact with Victor that they've traveled with him, that he went to, you don't go to Sioux Falls unless you're preparing for something. So I think it's going to be interesting. Now, don't get your hopes too high or too disappointed for the next 2 days because they're coming back on a back-to-back. They're not going to practice until about 5 or 6 o'clock on Thursday in New York when they decided to meet there because guys have been traveling for practice. But then it opens a back-to-back. They're playing the Knicks on Friday. The Spurs at home on Saturday. Might be a little bit too soon. I think then when you get a practice day and time off, you can work guys in. The following week, they have a nice 2-day break also. I know everyone wants everything now, but I think it might be a little bit more. Let's do this in the laboratory instead of in front of the lights.
And the one thing that I think we've said as this show has gone on and I've kind of come to the realization of too, is as much as we like focus on the schedule and we look at, man, I think you called it the heck week, or when you're playing the 4 playoff teams that you're going to be playing for playoff positioning.
I called it hell week, but I don't have the Ferraro girls in the house, so I can do it. But you can call it
just in
heck
case
week.
They watch it later. But Ira, bottom line, it's like the regular season is the regular season, and like we want to assign all sorts of meaning to these games, and I do think some mean more than others, and I do think, man, you've seen some great regular season games where you could tell it meant more to. I was watching that Milwaukee Phoenix game. It was last week, and it was like, man, both those teams were really into it, and ultimately Phoenix was able to pull away. But the reality is that as much as I like to scream and yell on Twitter when Jimmy Butler takes another 3-pointer in the last 30 seconds of the game, it's the regular season, and ultimately we would love to say that all of these games mean so much, and the Heat obviously want to win every single game. But the bottom line is, get healthy for the playoffs. Figure out who you are, develop chemistry, and honestly, I think 2 out of those 3 the Heat have, and the other one is one that they can't do a whole lot to impact themselves. They have to be as careful as possible and be cautious with certain injuries. But a lot of this is chance, and we've seen it over and over again. So bottom line, like we can go through all this stuff and try to say, oh well, this game is. It's the regular season, and I'm really curious to see, now that you brought all this up, what type of tweaks that they may implement as the rest of the season goes on.
We will have a fascinating final 6, 7, 8 weeks of the regular season, which most of the time you don't say that. You say you're just getting ready for the playoffs. It's crazy they're in first place, and there's still so many unknowns.
Let's see. Question here. What matchups would you like to see Miami avoid in the playoffs? And you mentioned a back and forth that you had with the scout, because I think we were on the same page before that Cleveland would be a tough one. Not that you thought you would lose to Cleveland, but that you would get beat up. Any change in that thinking after speaking with that scout?
No, I still would rather play Cleveland, though, because they don't have the playoff experience. I always want to play the glad to be here team. Oh, we're in the first round. Oh, we're out of the first round. Okay, we made the playoffs. Yay. So I think Cleveland's one of those teams. They're just glad to be there. I think Toronto was planning for a rebuilding year. And the way that Nick Nurse has played his guys 48 minutes a game, I think they might be exhausted come the playoffs, as good as they've looked against the Heat. So I think that might work for the Heat also. Whatever reason, Boston's been a tough matchup for them. The Brown and Tatum combination would be a little tough. But I don't care. I know I've spoken to so many people, including inside the Heat, and they're telling me, oh, Brooklyn, they don't play any defense. They still play for themselves. I still don't want to play a Nets team that might have Kyrie Irving, Ben Simmons, Kevin Durant, Goran Dragic, and Joe Harris in the first round.
Had they echoed the same sentiment since the Harden for Simmons move?
Yeah, I still think because they'll still have enough top-level talent that they can all of a sudden coalesce maybe later than any other team. So I still think, believe me, as long as I'm not going to Brooklyn in the first round, I feel much better about the first round. If you go to Brooklyn, you just don't know because that's the it team and because they're living in the moment.
You don't want to play Milwaukee, obviously. You mentioned Boston's a tough matchup. Beyond that, I know people say Toronto's length is going to give you problems, but I think you bring up a good point, kind of the happy to be here teams. You don't want to be the less talented team on the floor in the playoffs. And I think Brooklyn is the one team that like you may be able to beat matchup wise and because of what they said, but still right. Those guys are so talented. All right, guys, it's going to be a great final stretch run. We appreciate you hanging with us on this Wednesday, and great comments, great questions as always. We'll be right back here next week, same time, same place. The Big O Show rolls on next right here. Thanks for joining us inside.